In the quiet Austrian town of Amstetten, there stands a house whose facade has always seemed unremarkable, a garden neatly trimmed, shutters aligned, doors and windows without flaw. Yet beneath its foundation lay a structure that was never listed in any plan, never shown to visitors, and never spoken of beyond the man who built it. For 24 years, it remained hidden, a network of locked rooms, corridors no wider than the span of a man's shoulders, a space where light was artificial and the air was recycled endlessly. Within it lived a daughter, taken at 18, and the children she bore to her captor, a captor who was also her father. From above ground, he appeared ordinary enough to pass without suspicion. From below, his footsteps marked the hours, his keys determined the length of each day, and his rules shaped the limits of life itself. It is one of the most enduring and concealed crimes of the modern era, a case measured not in months or years, but in the span of a generation. As we open the record of the man who built a prison beneath his home, consider where you are as you listen, and when. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time of day it is. And if you wish to hear more accounts of crimes whose details outlast their headlines, remember to like this video and subscribe so you never miss what lies in the pages of the Gothic Ledger. It was a grey April afternoon in 2008 when the automatic doors of the regional hospital in Amstetten slid open to admit a pair who seemed, at first glance, mismatched. The man, 73 years old, thin but upright, kept a firm, almost proprietary grip on the girl's arm as he guided her inside. His face betrayed the unease of someone unaccustomed to scrutiny. The girl moved with halting steps, head lowered, as though the light of the lobby itself were a strain to endure. The triage nurse's first impression was simple, a grandfather bringing in his ailing granddaughter. But when her eyes adjusted to the pallor before her, that easy assumption faltered. The girl's skin was drained of all natural color, so pale that the faint branching pattern of her veins was visible beneath the surface. Her eyes were sunken, her lips cracked and without moisture. When she opened her mouth to answer a routine question, several teeth were missing entirely. The few that remained were darkened at the roots, held in place by little more than decay. The nurse glanced to her colleague over the desk, a brief silent exchange that passed in less than a heartbeat. Together they noted the same details: hair that had lost its pigment before its time, the posture of someone decades older, and a faint, sour odor that clung to her clothes as if from long confinement. She could not provide an identification card. No record existed in the hospital system. It was as though she had arrived from outside the framework of the modern world. While the girl was led to an examination bay, the man paced a measured path along the waiting room wall, avoiding direct eye contact. When asked for her details, he produced a statement with deliberate calm. She was his granddaughter. He offered no more, as if the fact were explanation enough. The girl sat on the edge of the bed, fingers curling into the fabric of her gown. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes fixed not on the medical instruments but somewhere far away. When the nurse leaned in to ask about her pain, she spoke barely above a whisper, the words strained and uneven. "No one," she said, "is going to believe me." It was not a complaint nor a plea, it was a diagnosis. On April 9, 1935, in the provincial town of Amstetten, Lower Austria, a child was born into a household already in retreat from itself. His parents, Maria and Josef Fritzl Sr., shared little more than a surname. The father was a severe alcoholic, his time divided between the tavern and the street. Within 4 years, he was gone entirely, leaving Maria and the boy alone in a home where tenderness would find no purchase. The absence of a father was not an emptiness to be mourned, but a vacancy filled with something far harsher. Maria ruled with a severity that carried no sense of proportion. Discipline came not as guidance but as correction in its most physical form. Neighbors recalled the sharp voice that carried through the walls and the boy's rigid posture, even at play. In 1944, news came from the front. Josef Sr. had died fighting for the armed forces of Nazi Germany. His name was added to a memorial plaque, though no grave was marked. The boy, now without a father, in a time when absence itself could be a stigma, learned early the utility of control, over his own demeanor, over what was seen, and over what was kept hidden. The war ended, but its residue remained. Amstetten was a place where secrets could be kept by the simple act of not speaking them. Josef learned to excel in schoolwork, to present an image of diligence and reserve. Those around him saw discipline. They did not see how it had been taught. By 1956, at 21, he married 17-year-old Rosemary, a local girl whose youth and deference suited him. Outwardly, the match was unremarkable. He secured work as an electrical engineer, a profession that gave him both steady income and the appearance of respectability. Behind that appearance, however, the pattern that had begun in childhood, the hunger for dominance, the comfort with secrecy, persisted. In 1967, a fracture in that facade appeared. Josef broke into the home of a 24-year-old nurse and raped her at knife point. Arrest followed, and conviction. He served 12 months of an 18-month sentence, returning to Amstetten with the record of a violent offender and a name whispered behind closed doors. It was not the only offense. Police suspected his involvement in other sexual crimes, including the attempted rape of a 21-year-old and incidents of indecent exposure. None of it would sever his marriage. Rosemary remained, the household intact, and the man from Amstetten resumed his life as if nothing had been interrupted. In 1966, the fourth of 7 children was born to Josef and Rosemary Fritzl. She was named Elisabeth. The household she entered was ordered to the measure of one man's authority. Meals taken without delay, tasks performed without variation, and obedience rendered without question. Within this system her mother moved quietly, never contradicting her husband. Elisabeth differed from her siblings in one notable way. Where the others learned to keep their eyes lowered and their speech minimal, she would sometimes question an instruction or fail to act quickly enough to satisfy her father. These were not acts of rebellion, but they were noticed and punished. Josef's discipline was methodical, delivered without visible anger, as if correction was simply part of the day's work. For Elisabeth, beatings were more frequent than for any of the others, the price of failing to conform entirely. When she reached 11, the nature of this control shifted. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the household, Josef's authority extended into sexual abuse. There was no declaration of change. It began as if it had always been intended, an unspoken expansion of power. The secrecy that already governed the Fritzl home now served as an unbreachable wall. No one intervened. No one asked. In public, Elisabeth attended school and later enrolled in a vocational course to train as a waitress. She performed well enough to avoid notice for the wrong reasons, but the constraint at home never loosened. Her siblings, shaped by the same environment, adapted through compliance or withdrawal. Elisabeth continued to test boundaries in small, private ways, none of which went unanswered by her father. In January 1983, at 15, she left. With the help of a co-worker, she travelled to Vienna. There was no formal plan, no substantial preparation, only the decision to put distance between her cell, F, and the house in Amstetten. For 3 weeks she remained away, uncontacted by her family. The police located her and returned her to her parents. Official records would note only that she had run away. No one asked why she had gone. No one questioned what awaited her on her return. The front door closed behind her once more, and in that silence lay the knowledge that escape, if not planned to perfection, would not be attempted again. In the late 1970s, Josef Fritzl began work beneath his home on Ibsstrasse. He described the project to neighbors, tenants, and family as a sensible precaution, a nuclear fallout shelter, necessary in the uncertain climate of the Cold War. At the time, such preparations did not invite suspicion. The work progressed over 6 years. Earth was carried out in small quantities, hidden among ordinary refuse. Concrete was poured in stages. Walls were reinforced with steel and moisture barriers. The space was divided into narrow passages, some no wider than a shoulder's breadth. Access to the innermost room required passing through 8 separate locked doors, each one sealed with a different mechanism. The effect was cumulative. No single barrier could be overcome without the means to pass the others. There were no windows, no direct ventilation from outside. The air was recycled mechanically, the noise of the system masked by the natural hum of the building above. Lighting was fluorescent, its constant tone offering no distinction between night and day. The rooms were small, functional, without decoration. It was a space built not for survival in a disaster, but for containment without witness. By 1984, the construction was complete. Josef alone possessed the full knowledge of its layout and the keys to its locks. He had not built a shelter. He had built a prison. On the evening of August 28, 1984, Elisabeth was 18 years old. She had completed her waitress training and was preparing for work in nearby Linz. Josef asked her to help carry a heavy door into the basement, the final piece, he said, in his long-running project. She followed him down the familiar steps, unaware that the descent would be her last as a free person. At the threshold of the concealed chamber, he instructed her to hold the door in place while he fixed it to the frame. When she complied, he swooped, nung it inward with force, striking her backward into the narrow space beyond. Before she could recover, he pressed a towel soaked in ether over her face. She lost consciousness within moments. The door closed, the locks engaged, and the series of barriers sealed shut. Above ground, the evening passed without incident. Below, the first hour of her 24 years in captivity had begun. When Elisabeth did not appear the following morning, Josef moved quickly to set the terms of her absence. He informed Rosemary and the family that she had left of her own will, and within hours reported her missing to the police. In his telling, she had spoken often of joining a group devoted to alternative beliefs, and he suspected she had finally acted on it. He named it a cult. The claim was delivered with the composure of someone certain of his facts. To the officers taking the report, the explanation was supported by precedent. In January of the previous year, Elisabeth had run away to Vienna and been returned 3 weeks later. That documented incident now served as a reference point, a reason to accept the possibility that she had left voluntarily again. Within days, a letter arrived. It was in Elisabeth's handwriting, postmarked from a town outside Amstetten. The message was direct. She had grown tired of living with her family, was safe, and did not wish to be found. She warned her parents not to search for her, implying that if they did, she would leave the country. The letter was not written freely. Josef had brought it to her in the basement, dictating its content and tone. She complied, knowing refusal would bring punishment. Once complete, he mailed it himself from a distant location, ensuring the postmark would appear to validate his account. For the police, the document closed the matter. They had a prior history of voluntary departure, a written statement from the missing person, and no evidence of a crime. No further investigation was ordered. The missing persons file was marked accordingly, and with it, the possibility of discovery diminished to almost nothing. Above ground, Josef continued his life without alteration. The family spoke of Elisabeth less often, the name becoming part of a past event rather than a present absence. Neighbors accepted the explanation, if they thought about it at all. In the official record, she had chosen to disappear. Below ground, Elisabeth's reality was measured not in years or months, but in the hours between his visits. The sound of keys at the outer door, the measured turn of each lock, and the knowledge that the world believed she was gone by choice. The first years passed without measure. In the narrow rooms beneath Ibstrasse, there was no sun to mark the day, no horizon to divide one week from the next. Fluorescent bulbs provided a constant, colourless light. When they were switched off, the dark was complete, a sealed absence broken only by the sound of her own breathing. The walls were bare concrete, cool to the touch, holding the damp of the earth beyond them. The air moved in a mechanical cycle, a steady hum masking the sounds from above. The space offered no vantage point, no escape for the eyes. It was neither night nor day in any real sense, only the intervals between his arrivals. Joseph's visits were consistent. Once or twice each day the sequence began, the faint click of the first lock, the muted thud of another door closing, the deliberate turn of each successive key. The pattern never changed. When the final door opened, he would step inside with food, water, or supplies. Conversation was minimal, and when he spoke it was usually to issue instructions or to remind her of her confinement. The assaults were a part of these visits, as regular as the delivery of meals. They were conducted without ceremony, without the pretense of intimacy, and often without looking at her directly. In those moments, the smallness of the room seemed absolute, no space to retreat to, no object to place between them. Over time, the absence of conversation became its own form of pressure. Days passed in near silence, the only voices she heard belonging to the television or radio he allowed her to keep. She began to lose the instinct to speak at all, her thoughts turning inward. There were periods when she considered ending her life. The means were limited, but the idea returned at intervals, a thought she examined and then put aside. The knowledge that he held every key, controlled every light, and decided the flow of a pain into the room left no illusions about control. By the close of the 5th year, the cellar was no longer a temporary condition. It was her geography, her weather, her world. The sound of his footsteps above, faint, then nearer, became the clock by which she measured her own existence, each approach bringing with it the only certainty she could rely upon. The first child was born in the cellar after 5 years of Elisabeth's captivity. There was no medical assistance, only the items Josef provided, a disinfectant bottle, a childbirth manual printed in the 1960s, and a single pair of scissors. Labour took place on the same narrow bed where she slept, in a room with no ventilation beyond the recycled air. The fluorescent light remained on throughout, its flat glow unchanging, indifferent. Terror gave way to something more deliberate. Once the child was placed in her arms, Elisabeth found a grim, sustaining purpose. In a space without seasons, without movement, the care of another life gave the hours a new structure. She fed, cleaned, and rocked the infant in the same few square meters, the room becoming a nursery and a cell at once. In time, more children followed. Each birth took place under the same conditions, no sterile instruments, no midwife, no pain relief. The manual's pages grew worn from handling. Supplies arrived at Joseph's discretion. No explanation was offered for why some items were withheld or delayed. Josef made his own decisions about the children's fates. For reasons he never stated, some were removed from the cellar within months of birth. He placed them on the family's doorstep, along with letters he had forced Elisabeth to write. In each letter, she claimed she could not care for the child and asked her parents to raise it. The tone was resigned, almost practical, crafted to avoid further inquiry. 3 children were chosen for this life above ground. They grew up in the Fritzl household, attending school, visiting neighbors, and living as though their mother had abandoned them. 4 others remained below with Elisabeth. One, a newborn named Michael, was born with respiratory distress. Without intervention, he died in the cellar shortly after birth. Josef removed the body and cremated it in the upstairs oven. No record was made, no burial held. The remaining children grew as their mother had, in the shadow of his authority, confined to the same airless rooms. As the years passed, the sounds of multiple voices filled the narrow corridors, but the walls absorbed them entirely. Outside there was no sign that a second family existed beneath the foundations of the house. The appearance of the first child upstairs was presented as a discovery. One morning Rosemary found a baby carriage on the front step. Inside was an infant wrapped in a blanket, alongside a letter in Elisabeth's handwriting. The message was brief. She could not care for the child, she trusted her parents to do so, and she was safe. It was the first of 3 such arrivals over the years. Each was staged in the same manner. The letters were written in the cellar under Josef's direction, then posted from towns outside Amstetten to strengthen the illusion. Their tone was consistent, resigned, without appeal for help, without any detail that might lead to her location. Rosemary followed the instructions in each letter. The children were brought inside, fed, and formally registered. To neighbors, the arrangement was explained in the same way Josef had explained Elisabeth's absence. She had joined a group that did not allow children and had left them with her family for their safety. One delivery carried an added detail. Shortly after finding the child, the telephone rang. When Rosemary answered, she heard Elisabeth's voice apologizing for leaving the baby. The voice was steady, but something in the tone felt artificial. She later told a social worker she believed it was a recording. The call repeated moments later, identical in every word and inflection. The unease deepened when she recalled that the family's number had been changed only recently. Elisabeth could not have known it unless told directly, yet the observation led nowhere. No follow-up visit from authorities resulted in a search. No formal suspicion attached itself to Josef. Tenants in the upstairs rooms sometimes remarked on unusual activity. They saw Josef carrying bags of groceries, furniture, and appliances into the basement at irregular hours. At night, muffled noises rose through the floor, voices, moan, movement, which he dismissed as plumbing or the settling of the building. One tenant's dog would growl at the cellar door, but found nothing visible to justify the reaction. Individually, these were small, inconclusive details. Together they formed a pattern that no one acted upon. The story Josef told was repeated often enough to sound complete. No one pressed against it hard enough to see where it might give way. Life below ground was not allowed to drift into aimless repetition. Within the narrow rooms, Elisabeth imposed a structure for her children that mirrored the world they could not see. Josef, perhaps to maintain the illusion of normalcy or to manage their behavior, brought books into the cellar. These became her tools. She taught the alphabet on scraps of paper, reading from worn pages until the words were familiar. Writing was practiced at the small table, their work illuminated by the cold constancy of the fluorescent lights. Lessons extended beyond reading and writing. She spoke of history, of cities they would never walk through, of seasons they could not feel. The radio, and later the television Josef allowed them, became her bridge to the outside, shaping their sense of a wider world that existed only in fragments. Her resilience was not in denying the reality of their confinement, but in refusing to let it define the boundaries of their minds. Within the limits she could not change, she preserved a sense of purpose. Each day's rhythm became predictable: morning lessons, shared meals, the brief diversions of recorded music or broadcast news, then rest. Above the signs of what lay beneath passed unnoticed or unacted upon. Tenants recalled that Josef would descend into the basement each morning at precisely 9 o'clock and remain there for hours. He told them he was working on blueprints, building machines for clients, and insisted no one enter while he worked. One tenant's dog, kept in the upstairs flat, would growl at night toward the section of floor above the cellar door. The sound was dismissed as the animal reacting to the building settling or to vermin. On some nights, muted voices and indistinct movement could be heard, thin, irregular sounds that Josef attributed to faulty pipes. Relatives noticed that the basement door was always locked, even when the rest of the house stood open. They knew Josef as a man who valued privacy in his work, and the habit was accepted without challenge. It was a quiet tragedy, built of moments that could have been questions but never became them. Each detail, on its own, appeared too slight to demand action. Together, they formed a record that only the cellar's occupants could have read for what it truly was. By 1994, the space beneath Ibstrasse had been in use for a decade. Its original 380 square feet, already divided into narrow chambers, had grown insufficient for the number of occupants. Josef announced to Elisabeth that the cellar would be enlarged. There was no choice in the matter. The work would be done by those who lived there. The expansion added just over 200 square feet, bringing the total to 590. The new layout included a narrow 16-foot corridor, 2 sleeping areas fitted with small beds, a basic kitchen corner, and a toilet partitioned from the rest by a thin wall. Even at its highest point, the ceiling reached only 6 feet. In other areas, barely 5.5. Dampness clung to the air, the smell of earth never fully sealed out by the concrete. The construction was done by hand. Elisabeth and her children removed soil with buckets, carried it to designated points for Josef to dispose of later. He warned them not to touch the outer cellar door, claiming it was wired to deliver a fatal shock. At other times, he threatened that any attempt to escape would release poison gas into the chamber. Both claims were false, but their purpose was to fix the idea of inescapable danger. Punishment remained part of the order below. A perceived disobedience could result in the lights being switched off for hours or days, the air left heavy and still. Food and water could be withheld for similar periods. These measures required no physical contact. The control was absolute. Within this confinement, Elisabeth maintained her own form of resistance. She requested books, and when they were provided, used them to teach her children to read and write. She explained the outside world through the filter of news broadcasts and radio programs, translating their meaning into terms the children could grasp. The children had no experience of daylight. Their concept of day and night was governed entirely by the state of the bulbs overhead. When they were on, lessons and activities began. When they were off, it was time to rest. Seasons passed without notice except for what was heard on the radio. Talk of snow in winter, warmth in summer, events as distant to them as another country. In this way, the cellar was both schoolroom and prison, its limits fixed by the walls, its horizons extended only by what could be described, imagined, or read. On April 19, 2008, the ordered pattern of life in the cellar broke. 19-year-old Kirsten, the eldest of Elisabeth's 3 children, who had never left the underground rooms, collapsed without warning. Her breathing was labored, her skin the color of paper, and she drifted in and out of consciousness. Elisabeth knew the cause was not sudden. Years without sunlight had thinned Kirsten's body to a fragile state. The chronic absence of vitamin D had weakened her bones, her immune system, and her strength. Illness came easily in the damp air, where the recycled ventilation carried the same breath day after day. But this time the decline had reached a point beyond what Elisabeth could treat with the meager supplies allowed to her. She pleaded with Josef for medical help. For 2 days he refused, pacing the line between control and neglect. The risk of exposure, of bringing a child from below into the world above, was one he had guarded against for nearly a quarter of a century. Yet Kirsten's deterioration made the alternative unavoidable. On the 3rd day, he relented. The journey to the hospital was the first time Elisabeth had seen the sky in 24 years. She was permitted only to help carry Kirsten to the car. Once the girl was secured inside, Josef locked Elisabeth back in the cellar. He drove alone to the regional hospital. Doctors who received Kirsten were immediately struck by her condition. Her skin was nearly translucent, the veins beneath it visible in fine detail. Her teeth showed advanced decay for someone of her age. She was severely dehydrated and in the early stages of kidney failure. More troubling still, there was no record of her in any medical or civil database. It was as if she had never existed. Josef explained she was his granddaughter, abandoned by his daughter years earlier. The story was brief and incomplete. Questions about her mothers, as identity and medical history were met with deflection. Staff noted his unease, the vagueness of his answers, and the incongruity of a young woman so aged in appearance. Within hours, the hospital's suspicions reached the police. What had begun as an isolated medical emergency was about to unseal the hidden life beneath Ibstrasse. One step in a sequence that would expose the walls, locks, and years of silence that had kept it concealed. By April 21, 2008, the police appeal for Elisabeth to come forward had reached national broadcasts. The missing persons file reopened after 24 years, its original conclusion, voluntary disappearance, now under direct challenge. The appeal carried urgency. Her daughter Kirsten was gravely ill, and without her medical history, the prognosis worsened by the hour. The letters Josef produced as proof of Elisabeth's independence were examined more closely. A cult expert, brought in by investigators, found them implausible. The phrasing was unnatural, the language oddly formal, the tone inconsistent with someone writing freely after decades away from family. The description of the supposed group she had joined was vague, lacking the hallmarks of a functioning community. For the first time, Josef's account was treated not as an explanation, but as a possible construction. Suspicion grew in plain view. Reporters covered the hospital case, neighbors revisited the unanswered questions of past years, and police tightened their focus on the man whose granddaughter's existence was undocumented. Inside the cellar, Elisabeth remained unaware of the public discussion. Her reality was unchanged. The same sealed rooms, the same controlled air, the same hours defined by the sound of locks. On April 26th, Josef told her they would both go to the hospital. The order came with conditions. She was to repeat the story he had told for decades, to say she had been living with a cult, to say nothing that would contradict him. He allowed the two remaining underground children to be moved upstairs in his absence. At the hospital, their arrival drew immediate attention. Police, already on alert, detained both for questioning. They were separated at once. Elisabeth was reluctant to speak, her answers short, her eyes lowered. Only when officers agreed to her single request, that she would never have to see her father again, did she begin. What followed was a sustained confession, given over hours, detailing her imprisonment since 1984, the births of her children in the cellar, the death of her infant son, and the years of abuse. That same night, police executed a search of the property on Ibstrasse. Keys taken from Josef opened each door in turn, revealing the corridors, the narrow rooms, and the life that had been hidden beneath the house for almost a quarter of a century. On April 26, 2008, Josef Fritzl arrived at the hospital, with Elisabeth beside him for the first time in 24 years. The instructions he had given her were exact. Repeat the story of the cult, speak nothing of the cellar, and offer no detail beyond what he had prepared. The weight of that narrative had held for decades. Within hours, both were detained. Elisabeth was separated from Josef immediately. At first, her answers to police questions were brief, her voice low, her eyes averted. The hesitation broke only when officers agreed to the one condition she placed before any statement: she would never have to see her father again. What followed was an uninterrupted confession. She described the night in August 1984 when she was locked away, the sequence of 8 doors between her and the outside world, the years of isolation, the births of her 7 children, the death of her infant son Michael, and the unrelenting abuse that defined her existence underground. While she spoke, police were already moving on the Fritzl home. The keys taken from Josef fit each lock in succession, the sound of tumblers turning, followed by the dull echo of hinges in the narrow space. Officers descended into the cellar and saw the low ceilings, the cramped sleeping areas, the fluorescent lights burning in perpetual imitation of day. It was a functioning space, but one that had no legitimate reason to exist. By the time the search concluded, the list of charges was forming: rape, incest, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and negligent homicide in connection with the death of Michael. The trial began in March 2009. On the first day, Josef denied the negligent homicide charge and the allegation of grievous assault for his threats to gas the cellar. He appeared composed, answering questions without visible strain. On the second day, Elisabeth entered the courtroom. She had attended the previous day in disguise. Now she was recognized. Their eyes met briefly. Witnesses said Josef went pale and lowered his head. The next morning, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. There was no further contest. The sentence was life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric facility, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. He stated he would not appeal. The court proceedings ended, but the reality of what had been uncovered would not easily return to silence. The trial of Josef Fritzl lasted 4 days in March 2009. Central to the prosecution's case was the recorded testimony of Elisabeth, nearly 11 hours of detail shown to the jury in 2-hour segments to lessen its cumulative weight. The account was clinical in its own way: the layout of the cellar, the sequence of births, the rules imposed, the punishments delivered. Jurors heard it in full silence, the only interruptions coming when the strain of listening required a pause. On the second day, Elisabeth entered the courtroom without disguise. The day before, she had been present but unrecognized. This time Josef saw her. The exchange lasted seconds, a glance that carried the fact of her survival against everything he had intended. Observers noted that he seemed to diminish at that moment, his posture collapsing inward. The following morning, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges, including negligent homicide. The sentence was life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric facility, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. He accepted the judgment without protest, stating he would not appeal. In the years that followed, the house on Ibstrasse was emptied. In 2013, the cellar was filled with concrete, erasing the space physically, but not from record. The building was later sold and converted into apartments. Inside the prison, Josef's life contracted further. In 2017, he changed his name to Josef Meyerhoff, an administrative act said to be an attempt to avoid recognition by other inmates. In 2019, reports described a marked physical decline, weight loss, diminished mobility, and a diagnosis of dementia. He withdrew from interaction, keeping to himself. Other prisoners, by choice, kept their distance. In 2021, a regional court considered moving him from the psychiatric unit to a standard prison. A higher court in Vienna overruled the decision, citing the continued risk he posed. He remained in secure psychiatric confinement, where he is likely to spend the remainder of his life. Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children were given new identities and relocated. All required ongoing therapy. The 3 raised above ground carried the dissonance of learning the truth about their mother. The 3 from below lived with the effects of years without sunlight or free movement. They remain beyond public reach, their lives defined not by the notoriety of the case, but by the private work of living after 24 years beneath a house that, from the street, had always appeared ordinary.